Hello and welcome back to PSD to HTML. Before we get started coding our HTML and our CSS, we need to figure out what images we want to pull out of our Photoshop file to include in our HTML. Now I'm going to turn off our guides here for a moment so we can see things a little bit better. And as we mentioned before, we're not going to be exporting our icons, our social media icons, or the icons in our navigation bar. We're not going to be exporting those as images. Instead, we're going to be using something different. We're going to be using an icon font to display those particular icons. So we don't need to worry about exporting those. However, we do have a couple of images we do need to export. First of all, we have the mobile devices here in the content slider, and we also have the background for our content slider. Now, the way you export those particular images really just depends on how you want your content slider to function. If you want to use the exact same background for all of your slides and you just want that background to stay still, then you would export the background image separately, which is what we're doing here. However, if each slide has a different background, and if that background can be the same image as whatever's in the foreground, such as these mobile devices, then you can export all of that as one image. However, I want to export these separately. So I'm going to have a separate file for the background and for the mobile devices. Everything else we see here at the top of the page for the most part can be created with our icon font. Now the left and right arrows here on our content slider, those are going to look different as well. Instead of using these particular graphics, we're going to be using some really nice looking left and right arrows that we can find in our icon font. So we don't need to export those either. But as we scroll down, you'll see at the very bottom we have a few images that we're going to be using for our photo stream, our thumbnails down here at the bottom. Now we have a couple of placeholder images here, and we're not going to be using these particular graphics for the placeholder images. Instead, we're going to be using a very, very helpful site called placehold.it, which allows us to create dynamically some placeholder images for our mockups, and that's going to make things really easy. So having said that, let's get started exporting our images. Now I used to use the slice tool to cut everything up and export our images that way, but that was back when I was using tables for layouts, and I haven't used tables for layouts in a long, long time. So I usually stay away from the slice tool when dealing with images. Instead, I prefer the good old-fashioned drag and drop method. So I'm just going to drag each of the layers that we need here into a new file and export them that way. So the first thing I want to do is the background here for our content slider. So with our move tool, we can right click on that background and we can choose which layer we want to select. And the default layer that's selected should be this slider BG layer, which is the layer we want. And when we click on that, you'll see that that highlights that layer in your layer stack. And then we can click and drag that layer around. But what I want to do is I want to see how big the content is for that layer. Now I know that it's 960 pixels wide because that's how wide our website is going to be. But how tall is it? I don't know. So we need to figure that out. Well, one way we can figure that out is once we have that layer selected, we can command click on the thumbnail area of that layer, or control click if you're using a PC. And when we command click or control click there, you'll see we've made a selection of that layer. We can see the marching ants selection around those graphics. So then we can just open up the info panel. And if you don't have your info panel over here on the right, you can find it under the window menu. But once we open up the info panel, we can see the width and height here. So it's 960 pixels wide by 260 pixels tall. So I'm going to create a new Photoshop file, Command N or Control N if you're using a PC. And we're going to make it 960 pixels wide by 260 pixels tall and click on OK. Then we're going to jump back over to our corporate design file. I'm going to hit Command D or Control D to turn off those marching ants, to turn that selection off. And then again, making sure that we have the slider BG layer selected here, we're going to use the move tool to click and drag that up, and we're going to drag it onto the tab for our new file. And then I'm going to hold on to Shift as I release the mouse button, and by holding on to Shift, that will place it right in the center of that particular image. And there we go. So we have it where it needs to be. Now we can just save it for the web. So I'm going to go to File, Save for Web, and I'm going to save it as JPEG high quality. And we see that it's just 5.4K, so it's a nice small image. And we're going to click on Save. Now I'm going to navigate back to our project files folder, And under the resources folder, I'm going to create a new folder here called img for images, and we'll save this inside the images folder. So I'm going to call this slider-bg.jpg. So we'll save that, and then we'll jump back over to the corporate design.psd file. And the next thing I want to export is this image of the mobile devices here. So I'm going to right click on the mobile devices there, and those are all on one layer right now. So we can click on that layer name and it will select that layer for us. And once that layer is selected, we can use the move tool to drag those up onto the Untitled tab and then just drop them here. So I'm going to drag them over. It doesn't matter where we drag them as long as we can see all of our image, as long as we haven't accidentally cut off any of our image. And then we're going to basically just delete our other two layers so that we have a transparent background. And then I want to trim this image down. So I'm going to come to the image menu, click on trim, and I'm going to trim based on transparent pixels. So it will basically get rid of all the transparent pixels around the edges and just leave enough to show all of the mobile device. So we'll click on OK. And there we go, it trims it down for us. So then we'll save for web. Again, we can go to File, Save for Web, or we can use the keyboard shortcut, which for the Mac is Command, Shift, Option, and S, or on a PC, that would be Control, Shift, Alt, and S. And then you'll notice that the transparent background went away, and that's because we have JPEG selected right now. So if I want to use that transparent background, which I do, we need to switch this to a PNG 24. And the PNG 24 is the best option for creating transparent backgrounds. If you try to use a GIF, it will often look kind of pixelated around the edges. So be sure to use a PNG 24 when you're doing this. And then just click on Save. And we'll save that again in the IMG folder as mobile-devices.png. Okay, so let's jump back into our corporate design file. And the only other images we need to export are going to be these 10 images down here at the very bottom for our photo stream. So I'm going to do this a little bit of a different way. I'm going to go back into our Untitled file here, and I already know that each of those thumbnails is 50 pixels wide by 50 pixels tall. So I'm going to resize our file. In fact, let's just close this one, and we'll create a new file that is 50 pixels wide by 50 pixels tall. So there's our file. Then we're going to come back into our corporate design file, and I'm just going to align all of these images on top of each other. So I'm going to right click on the first image here, click on the name, which is Flickr01, because I pulled all of these from my Flickr account. And we'll just grab all of those layers here, Flickr01, all the way up through Flickr10. We'll grab all of those images, make sure that they're all selected. And then I'm going to come up here to the very top, make sure you have the move tool selected. And we're going to click here to make sure that the top edges are aligned, which they already are, but go ahead and do that just to make sure. And then click here to make sure the left edges are aligned. Now all of those images are stacked right on top of each other, and since all of those image layers are still selected, we can just click and drag all of those up onto the Untitled tab. And then again, before we drop it, before we let go of our mouse button, hit Shift, and while holding onto Shift, let go of the mouse button, and that will drop them all into place. And for some reason, it nudged them all down and to the right. So if I just hit the up arrow and the left arrow key once, that should get them where they need to be. So then we can just turn our layers off and on as needed. So we'll come down until we have all of our layers turned off except for Flickr01, and then we'll start saving them. So I'm going to save this one. Again, we're using the keyboard shortcut for Save for Web, which is Command, Shift, Option, and S, or again on a PC, Control, Shift, Alt, and S. So these are going to be JPEGs again. So I'll choose JPEG High, and then we'll click on Save. And these are going to be for our gallery. So in fact, they're going to be thumbnails. So I'll just give them a nice short name, TH01 for thumbnail 1. So we'll click on Save, and there we go. So then we'll just turn on Flickr02 and then save that for web and call it TH02. So we're going to do that for each one. So we'll turn on the third layer, save for web, hit enter, because the last settings we used are automatically going to be selected again. So it still says JPEG High. So we can just hit enter again and then type in the new name. So TH03, hit enter. So then we'll turn on Flickr04. We'll save that as TH04. Turn on Flickr05, save for web, save that as TH05. And we'll scroll up a little bit here. We'll turn on Flickr 06, save that for web, save it as th06. Turn on number 7, save for web, th07. Turn on number 8, save for web, th08, and then just 2 more times. We'll save for web for this one, th09, and finally for our flamingo, we'll save for web there, save it as th10.jpg. So we've got all of our images saved. Now we can jump into our HTML and start making this happen. So we'll get started on that in the next video. Thank you for watching.